Today, we are going to talk about methods and access modifiers, but mostly methods. I may or may not talk about access modifiers in depth, depending on how long this takes. So, what are methods? Methods are reusable blocks of code that perform a specific task. They're typically defined within a class. And the nice thing about methods is that you can re-execute them. And it improves readability and maintainability. And that all adds up to scalability. So the bare minimum for a method signature is the name of the method and the parameter of this. So essentially, the method has to have a name and arguments that are passed into it. And methods can return a value using return, or they can be void, which means that they're not really returning a value, but it is void. So parameters can be passed by value, yada, yada, yada. We can talk about that another time. It supports method overloading. That can be talked about when we deal with inheritance. But it's important that methods can be instance methods or static methods. What's the difference? You'll see in a moment. But an instance method is a method that's bound to an individual object. So classes are blueprints for objects. And when you instantiate an object, that method is bound to that particular object. Static methods, on the other hand, are bound to a class. So it's shared. So this allows a method to be shared across all instances of a class. And then we have several access modifiers. So we have public, protected, default, and private. Before we talk about access modifiers, we'll talk a little bit about syntax. So your syntax is, so every method has a access modifier. And even if the access modifier is not visible, it's there. And then you can have the plus or minus static keyword. And then there's a return type. It can be void, or it can be any of the defined types. And it could be a primitive, or it could be a reference type. The name of the method and the parameters. So a method can have no parameters, or it could have several parameters. Then, of course, there's the implementation of the method, which we call the body. Okay, we'll briefly touch on access modifiers. So we'll start with the least restrictive first. So public, that means it's accessible everywhere. Okay, everywhere. Okay, within the class, within the package, even within subclasses. Protected means that it's not quite accessible everywhere, but it's accessible within the package and throughout any subclasses. This will become more apparent when we talk about inheritance. Default, so when there's no modifier, like remember when I was saying that whether you have a modifier explicitly listed there or not, there is a modifier. This is one of those modifiers. If you don't put a modifier, it's default by default, I guess. And it's also known as package private. It's accessible within the same class, within the same package, but if you go outside that package, you're not going to get to it. And then, of course, private means that it's only accessible within the class. So now that the didactic portion of this lecture is over, let's go to our IDE and have a little fun. All right, we are back in our IDE. Since the last video, I changed the appearance to dark mode, and I realized I was just a little bit happier. But my happiness is not what's important here. What's important is that we talk about methods. So we have 4 exercises. The 4th one I'm going to leave to another time. So in the math utils class, create an instance method which adds 2 numbers and returns a double. Okay, so what this is going to demonstrate is adding a return type and creating an instance method. So let's go to our mathutils class. Okay. So we're just going to call this add two numbers. So we'll make this a public method. So public. And then our return type is integer. We'll just call it int. Add two numbers. So we have two arguments, which are the two numbers, integer A, integer B. And then we're going to return A plus B. And that's it. That's our method. So let's run it. Well, let's. So here's the thing. It's an instance method. So let's see what happens if we try to call it on the class. So and then of course nothing pops up. So let's instantiate this class. So all right, so we're creating a new class. And now that we've instantiated this class, we'll just put this in a variable. Okay. Add numbers. Okay, here we go. Add two numbers. And let's add 2 plus 2 because we all know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, and let's print this out. All right, let's print out our sum. Okay, and it printed out 4. So we created an instance method and it returned oh, and it was supposed to return a double, not an integer. So let's go and fix that. See, all right. So it's a double, so it's a decimal, so it's 4.0. Okay, let's move on to the next method. Before we move on to the next method, just notice that this is an instance method because it's bound to this instance of a class add numbers because we have to instantiate the class. Now let's create a static method which squares a number and returns an integer. So let's go back to our mathutils. So this is going to be public static. Static means that it's bound to the class itself. Square the number. This will be an int. Okay. And then of course our return type is also going to be an int. So let's return. We'll just keep it simple num times num. That's num squared. There is a utility class where you can actually square numbers, but we're just going to keep it simple here. Okay. Let's go to our run methods. So our squared number equals mathutils. And see, the square number is bound to the class. And we'll just square 3. And we know that 3 squared is 9. Okay, we'll print this out. we can comment this out since we're done here. Let's run this. So it prints 9. So we've successfully created an instance method before, but now we've created a static method. Why would you need a static method? For utility classes. Like let's say, okay, you want a general purpose class. You don't want to have to instantiate a new object every time you want to use the method. This is a use case for that. Okay, so in the math utils class, create an instance method which prints instance method called. Okay, I know it sounds a little silly, but there is a point to this. So we'll do public void print instance method called, and this will take no arguments because we're just printing something. Okay, so we're going to print instance method called. So, and you know what? Let's comment this back in so that we can use our instance, our object to print the method. So we try to call math utils. Okay. The only method that comes up is the square number method because that's bound to the class. But if we call the add numbers object, then that means that you can use this instance method. Notice here, though, that you can still use the square number method. So, but let's use the instance method. Okay, we picked the wrong one. Print instance method. Okay, let's run this. Instance method call. So there you go. Let's see what happens if we try to use the static method. So we do have okay. So saying that it should be accessed in a static way. Okay. Let's see what happens. Will this allow us to execute our method? Let's comment this out. Okay, so it still executed the method. So you can call a static method on an instance of a class, but it should be called, but the purpose of a static method is so that you can call it on a class itself. However, you cannot, you need a object to call an instance method. You can't call it using the class. All right, I think I'm done. I will talk about access modifiers at another time because, I got things to do, places to be, but I will never stop learning and I'll never stop sharing my knowledge. Peace.